Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Against Me, titled Transgender Dysphoria Blues. Now, it's a fairly well-known fact in punk music that if you stick around long enough in the scene, you're gonna get sick of punk music to some extent. As much as I love punk, it's a genre that has a certain instrumental simplicity in its purest form, which means that many acts will stop playing punk at some point in their careers and move in different instrumental directions. Some will go towards mainstream pop, some will go towards folk, a fair chunk will gravitate towards metal and the hardcore scene, and of course, you have post-punk. And as the genre changes, the songwriting topics, well, they tend to change as well. And thus, unfortunately, you end up getting all manner of cries of sell out the second that the band opts for a different sound. And really, I don't think that's entirely fair at all. The set of punk ideals and songwriting topics have always been nebulous and hard to define, and there have been punk acts like, say, Green Day, who have held on to decidedly punk sensibilities lyrically while exploring arena rock and other genres. I'd only be inclined to brand an act a sellout if the songwriting took a notable dip in quality. And say what you will about Green Day, but their shallow and hyperbolic lyrics have been a consistent factor throughout their entire career. But then we have an act like Against Me, a punk act that sprung up in the early 2000s with serious songwriting chops, a knack for great hooks, and a lot of instrumental talent with real punk flair. And yet after those first two LPs, it'd be hard to argue that they didn't sell out in some way. From searching for more clarity onward, you could see those changes across the board, with the grime and instrumental texture slowly being scraped away, the ideals and wry self-awareness that characterized their early work falling apart, and the songwriting only becoming across as more conventional and painfully mundane in its choice of topics and subject matter. The band still had a knack for great hooks and catchy material, but by the time White Crosses was released in 2010, look, I'd have a hard time calling the band a punk act rather than your standard arena rock crowd pleaser, with lyrics that were only shallower than ever and a seemingly complete lack of self-awareness. And look, I like earnestness in music, but Against Me's early appeal for me was the balance between razor-sharp insight and self-aware populism. And by the time White Crosses came around, that balance was almost entirely gone, leaving behind a pretty solid but not particularly interesting arena punk band. But I have to admit, I was curious about their newest release, Transgender Dysphoria Blues. The title was inspired by lead singer Laura Jane Grace coming out as a trans woman in 2012 and her struggles with gender dysphoria that she's endured her entire life. In terms of an album topic, well, look, you don't see that many albums discussing trans issues. And coupled with the fact that Against Me were now on their own label and were supposedly returning to their rougher sound, look, I was really interested in what this record would put forward. So, how did it turn out? Well, the album is pretty damn good. I wouldn't call it great by any stretch of the mind, but in terms of late period Against Me records, it's a promising step and it's an enjoyable listen. Even though I'd argue it didn't quite go far enough to become something truly special or memorable in my mind, which I'll have to admit is a little disappointing. Now, I should explain this, so let's start with the unequivocal positives that Against Me have always brought to the table on their albums. Laura Jane Grace has a phenomenal voice that's great for punk, harsh enough to have raw energy and passion, but yet melodic and emotive enough to show real complexity and nuance in her delivery. And the band's knack for crisp, melody-driven punk rock with great guitar riffs will always be something that I've liked. Longtime drummer Warren Oates did leave the band for this record, but punk veteran Adam Willard, formerly of the Rocket from the Crypt, The Offspring, and Angels and Airwaves, he steps up and adds a lot of thundering force to this record that really stands out. And better still is the production, which has stripped away most of the unnecessary theatrics from previous records into something more raw and impassioned. Not quite as gritty as their earlier albums, which is a bit of a disappointment for me, but showing a lot more texture than Against Me has put forward in years. But the big drawing card of this album is the subject matter and the theme, where for once I actually feel that Against Me's newfound earnestness actually manages to pay some big dividends. Laura doesn't pull punches as she describes her frustration and lack of belonging in society, the judgmental stares and the discrimination. In particular, she focuses on society's standards of beauty with regards to women, and this is where the album actually approaches something really special, as she both yearns for the acceptance that such an image would provide for her and recoils against the shallowness that sometimes that image represents, which comes across across most strongly in Fuck My Life 666, one of the big album's standout. And then you have tracks like Drinking with the Jocks, which viciously targets the social strata, which she always felt uncomfortable before transitioning, and now she's showing how she's gonna flip it on its head. The best tracks on this album are those that focus on the transgender dysphoria, and Laura's intricately written, incredibly descriptive, pull no punches style of lyricism works absolutely great, especially on with album standouts like True Trans and Paralytic State, songs that just work for me. But I just wish that the rest of this album was as consistently strong as those songs. Whenever this album moves away from the transgender topics towards more conventional punk subjects, you can almost feel the energy and interest in the material just drip away. The songs might not be badly written. In fact, they're not. They're actually reasonably well written. Laura Jane Grace is a good songwriter. But material like Osama bin Laden as a Crucified Christ and Black Me Out, they just feel strikingly out of place on this album. Shots of white hot rage that feel directionless and ultimately don't add up to much. This becomes most frustrating because while the material we get talking about the trans experience, it's very strong, it doesn't quite feel completely realized or completely articulated. I feel that there's more sides of the story that I'm just not hearing, which leaves me wondering why Laura didn't write more in line of that material instead of relying on more conventional subjects. And you know what, maybe it's just me, but I find this album a little bit underwritten. Even some of the best songs very quickly begin to repeat themselves in terms of verse-chorus structure, and sure, you get that with punk music. Raw force over nuance, but when you have such an interesting and intensely personal subject, which I'm sure Laura could talk about at great length, I'm a little bit confused why she thought that repetition would prove more effective to deliver her message. Overall, it adds up to an album that doesn't nearly feel as focused as it should, and I gotta admit, that was a bit of a disappointment. So look, I don't think Against Me are going to be able to recreate their glory days in the early 2000s. And look, I'm not asking for that either. The band is very clearly in a different place. They've advanced since that particular time. But for an album tackling a subject that's rarely ever spoken about in music, I can't help but feel that Transgender Dysphoria Blues feels a little underweight. I do like this album, certainly more than Against Me's last two releases, but I can't help but feel that this record should have had a bit more of a punch and a little bit more of a tighter focus. Now that being said, it's definitely a good step in the right direction in terms of production and subject matter. There are some great hooks on this album, and when Laura Jane Grace just goes for broke, she really nails it. This album is a strong 7 out of 10 from me, and even if you're not a huge fan of punk music, I urge you all to check it out. After all, the roots of punk were inspiring social change in a world where the trans community gets discriminated against more than most. Awareness and social change can only make things better, and you know what, I'd be happy with Laura Jane Grace leading the charge, at least in terms of spreading awareness. So you should all check it out, at least in terms of that. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. With regards to the language that I'm using, I've tried to be as sensitive as I could towards Laura Jane Grace's transition period. And if I use any particular language in a wrong way, I'm trying to learn here. So if you guys have any comments in that regard, so please leave it in the comments here. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to be as progressive as I can here. In other words, if there's any other albums you want me to cover from 2014, or if there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'd be more than happy to take a listen. Until then, see you next time.